Hi there, I'm Sashi Sivram Krishna and welcome to my course Macroeconomics, a modern money theory perspective. We are in part 1 of the course Macroeconomics and Money. In lecture 12, we will present the neoliberal paradigm. The neoliberal paradigm essentially drew from the classical school of thought and was ultimately enshrined in a document called the Washington Consensus that outlined the set of stabilization, growth, as well as development policies that could be adopted by countries in the era of globalization. The first tenet of the Washington Consensus was fiscal discipline. As we discussed, the classical way of thinking replaced Keynesian fiscal policies and instead suggested that monetary policies would be sufficient to ensure low and stable inflation while at the same time ensuring high levels of GDP growth. Government spending should be restricted instead of stabilizing an economy or managing an economy, should instead be spent on infrastructure, health, and education. A country should adopt flexible exchange rate policies rather than pegging their exchange rates to any particular level and let their exchange rates float. Another important tenet of the Washington Consensus was a greater emphasis on privatization as well as deregulation of the private sector, essentially to unleash the production capabilities of a country and remove supply side constraints. Tax reforms were required to make it easier for the private sector to pay the taxes as well as remove uncertainty in tax rates, and this would actually enhance tax revenues over a longer period of time. The era of globalization brought greater emphasis on trade liberalization and adherence to World Trade Organization principles of reducing tariff barriers, removal of non-tariff barriers like quotas, and as well as allowing for free capital mobility. At one point, there was also an emphasis on capital account convertibility by the International Monetary Fund, which the pressure was relieved on many developing countries after the Asian crisis, but there was a subtle emphasis that countries should adopt capital account convertibility, and this was possible if they were able to ensure fiscal discipline and keep inflation at low and stable rates. Finally, we have the emphasis on monetary policy through independent central banks and the adoption of inflation targeting. Like we discussed earlier, there was also an emphasis on structural reforms, especially reforms in labor markets, where minimum wage laws as well as collective bargaining is kept to a minimum, and as far as possible also be removed in a sense. Along with this classical economic school of thought, the Washington Consensus also argued that democracy would be the best political system to go along with these policies and ensure longer term development as well as poverty alleviation across the world. We can also look at the neoliberal paradigm from a slightly different perspective here. For instance, stabilization would focus on laissez-faire policies, leaving it to the market system to self-adjust and bring about full employment. Growth was endogenous, and competitive markets would ensure technological progress as well as innovation by the private sector and did not need state intervention through centralized laboratories and so on. Finally, development was seen as a trickle-down process, so higher growth rates would make more financial resources available to the state, which could be spent on infrastructure as well as public goods. The key policies that the country had to adopt on the economic front was essentially structural reforms, which can be broken down into three components: privatization, so greater incentives for increasing output, competing with other players in the market internationally, and so on. Liberalization, so that we deregulate markets and let the private sector, in the pursuit of profits, bring about greater development for a country. Finally, globalization, that goods and services move freely across borders, capital moves more freely across borders, and essentially the world works as one large market, so that the optimal allocation of resources happens across space. We can summarize the neoliberal paradigm, which has been adopted by the European Union, where they look at greater fiscal responsibility as an important component, which, along with structural reforms, would ensure high levels of investment, and this turns into a virtuous loop which will bring about greater stability, growth, as well as development of countries. Although the neoliberal paradigm did bring in an era of prosperity with high GDP growth, low and stable inflation, as well as moderate levels of unemployment, there was rising discontent with the neoliberal paradigm. This, in some sense, led to the failure of the neoliberal paradigm, and today we can witness anger across the world with neoliberal policies. This failure of the neoliberal paradigm is evident when we look at the divergence between productivity growth and wage growth. And this graph makes it very evident that in the United States, while productivity has grown rapidly, the wage growth has stagnated. So workers are not getting paid in sync with their contribution to increases in the overall product. Now, this also causes concern as to how will the output, the increased output, be consumed in an economy, and wouldn't there be a shortage in aggregate demand in some sense? This was sustained only by the working class getting more and more indebted and living through credit beyond their means as reflected in their real wage. So this gap was essentially covered through credit, so that workers would be actually consuming what they produced and aggregate demand wouldn't be slack in the economy. But indebtedness has also brought in anger, and the disparities between the rich and poor have grown to enormous extents, as is evident in the data and in several articles which have shown that it's not just within the United States that inequalities have risen, but also between regions in different countries of the world, as well as across countries of the world, both in income as well as wealth. One reason for this gap in between productivity and wage growth can be attributed to the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, the adoption of the flexible exchange rate systems, but that must be seen as part of the neoliberal paradigm than an aside. If you recall what we said under the Washington Consensus, that flexible exchange rates as well as capital account convertibility is an integral part of the neoliberal paradigm itself. So this graph is a telling instance of what has happened under neoliberalism and could be one of the major reasons for the growing anger and discontent across the world against the neoliberal paradigm as well as neoliberal policies that were widely adopted all through the last decades of the 2000s.